All right, welcome back. We're going to be doing Aristotle on the Good Life today. So I had you read this passage from Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 7. I encourage you to read as much of the Nicomachean Ethics as you can. If over the summer you have some extra time, it's worth sitting down and working your way through the first few books at least. Parts of it are rough going, but other parts, especially in Book 2, read really smoothly, and it certainly rewards the effort, the more complicated bits. This work on virtue and the good life has been foundational to a lot of the rest of moral theorizing and theorizing about the nature of happiness in the good life since Aristotle. So we have this distinction that Aristotle draws right at the outset. Before he even gets into the what is the good life question, he says, let's draw some distinctions. And the first two are going to look familiar, but there's a third one that's really important. He says, we say that an end pursued in its own right is more complete, and by that he just means better, than an end pursued because of something else. Okay, so there's an end that is pursued in its own right is better than one that's pursued for the sake of something else. And then he says, an end that is never choice-worthy because of something else is more complete than ends that are choice-worthy both in their own right and because of this end. Hence, an end that is always choice-worthy in its own right and never because of something else is complete without qualification, or the very best thing. So when we discussed hedonism, we had a theory of value, and that theory of value told us what the fundamental units of intrinsic goodness are. And the key distinction there was between extrinsic value, or instrumental value, and intrinsic value. Extrinsic values are things that are valuable because of something else. So money's value, for example, is entirely extrinsic to it. Intrinsic value is something that's good in its own right. All by itself, it's worth having, regardless of what you can get with it. And what Aristotle's doing here is taking on board that distinction between those two kinds of value, although he doesn't put it in those terms. That's basically what he's doing. But he's saying we need to be more fine-grained within the category of intrinsic value, because there are important ways in which some intrinsic goods differ from others. We can call this a distinction between non-ultimate and ultimate intrinsic value, is the way I'm going to put it. Non-ultimate intrinsic value, these are things that are both intrinsically good, so desirable for their own sake, even if nothing else resulted, but they also get us something else, or they can get us something else. So they have both this quality of they would be sufficient on their own if you couldn't get anything else from them, but as a matter of fact, you can get something else from them. And so they have both intrinsic and extrinsic value. The ultimate intrinsic good, if there is one, though, would be something that only has intrinsic value, that no one ever chooses for the sake of what one can get from it. Aristotle thinks this distinction is key, and this is foundational to his theory of value, and so to his theory of the good life. He says this, now happiness, more than anything else, seems to be complete without qualification. And remember, complete without qualification was this idea of the very best thing, which for him is the ultimate intrinsic value, something we never choose for the sake of anything else. He says this at the end of this paragraph here. Happiness, no one ever chooses for the sake of something else or for the sake of anything else at all. The only reason you choose it is just for its own sake. The contrast he's drawing, though, he goes on to say in the second sentence, we always choose happiness because of itself and never because of something else. In the third sentence, he says, honor, pleasure, understanding, and every virtue we certainly choose because of themselves. He says, in that regard, pleasure is like happiness. So here he's making a small concession to the hedonist who says pleasure just is happiness. He's like, they're not the same, but there is a similarity. They're both intrinsically desirable. The same goes for honor, understanding, and moral virtue. These are things we want for their own sake, regardless of what we can get from them. But he notes, it also does make sense to ask, why do you want knowledge? Why do you want pleasure? Why do you want honor? Why do you want to develop a good moral character? Those questions aren't senseless. And in fact, when we think about our answers to them, they tend to be something like, well, because I think that's a key ingredient in living well. I think that's a key ingredient in what he's calling happiness. And I noted in class, we're going to be, that translation as happiness for Aristotle's a bit controversial. Probably a better translation would be flourishing. We want pleasure in part because pleasure is essential to living a flourishing life. We want to learn, to study, because knowledge and understanding is essential to the good life. And we want to develop ourselves morally into good people because that also, we think, is necessary for living well, at least according to Aristotle. So these things, honor, pleasure, understanding, and every virtue, he's saying these are intrinsically valuable. Even if somehow they didn't make you happy, they still would be good. But they do, in fact, contribute to your happiness. And so they both have intrinsic and extrinsic value. Happiness is the only thing for which it makes no sense to ask why one wants it. So here is a kind of categorization, picture, I guess, of Aristotle's theory of what is valuable, what is good. On the far left, we have things that have merely extrinsic value, right? So I've got their money, clothing, housing, food, even something like, sports equipment or running shoes. I buy running shoes a lot, even though these days I don't run as much as I used to, because the way I run, I work through the rubber in the running shoe quickly, and so I end up having these holes in the bottom within a couple months, even if I'm not putting in a ton of miles. And so I go through these things very quickly, and they're expensive. It's irritating. In any case, the reason I want the running shoe is entirely something extrinsic. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. And then when we move toward the center of this chart, we enter the realm of intrinsic value. And there's a whole lot of things in the realm of intrinsic value. Remember that for the hedonists, there was just one thing in the realm of intrinsic value. The only intrinsic value for the hedonist was happiness or pleasure. They're the same thing for the hedonist. Aristotle says they're not the same thing. And moreover, many things are intrinsically good. Honor, health, pleasure, yes. Not the only intrinsic good, but one among many. Beauty, knowledge, moral virtue, friendship, Aristotle cares a lot about. Those things are all intrinsic goods, but he says those are non-ultimate intrinsic goods, because we can ask sensibly, why do you want to have friends? Why do you want to be a good person? Why do you want knowledge? And the answer to that question, we could respond by saying, well, they're just good in their own right. But it would equally be a good answer if we said, well, because I want to be happy, or because I want to live a good life. Or in Aristotle's terminology, I want to achieve eudaimonia, or the well-lived, flourishing life. And on the far right here, we have the ultimate intrinsic value, which is something that is desirable for its own sake and not at all for the sake of anything